Tēnā koutou katoa. Thursdays is my no PowerPoint day, so you're going cold turkey, and I've got writing. I just thought I'd start my stories with this. This seemed like an interesting challenge to take 10 minutes to sort of do an overview of my research. And I thought a bit about it, and I thought, well, I've edited poetry, I've discovered lost manuscripts, I've written biographies, I've critiqued literature, I've developed digital projects. Currently I'm a Quake Corps investigator, I'm the literary executor of an important Māori writer, I'm trying to write a biography of Charles Brash, I'm an investigator in a political science project related to Ukrainian cultural heritage and having the honour of working with Natalia Shaban on that. And when I'm not doing that, I'm also head of the English department. I've had papers in linguistics journals, and I'm not a linguist. I'm very proud of the fact that I have a paper about designing a post-quake art bridge in an engineering journal. But if my research was painting, it would be hanging in the confused Impressionist gallery. And I've tried to work out why I research the way I do, and I think there is some sort of method there. It's a method that is interested in rediscovering the past. It's interested in the recovery of stories and memories. And sometimes it's just because I saw a need. Back in, I think, 1992, Victoria University appointed me as a PhD student to teach poetry to students, and I discovered that New Zealand literature poetry was largely out of print, and so I did some looking around, and I found out that there were these amazing new technologies. There were these things called CD-ROMs, and Adobe Systems had just brought out a new way of sort of making documents that looked like the originals. It was called the portable document format, and I thought, well, if I could put PDFs and CD-ROMs together, then I could make thousands of books of poetry available to my students. So I can't point to a straight path or a smooth trajectory for my research, but I can point to a common thread, my interest in storytelling. And hence my title, which I borrowed from Jonathan Gottschall's book, The Storytelling Animal. It's a title that appeals, but I'm ambivalent about Gottschall's premise that he says when we submit to fiction, we allow ourselves to be invaded by storytellers who seize control of us cognitively and emotionally. I don't think of storytelling as having these sorts of extremes of abuse, but I did like his subtitle as well, because Gottschall's subtitle is Stories Make Us Human. We're all storytellers. My fellows have all just demonstrated that with some wonderful stories in their presentations. I have no claim to exceptionalism. Every year I supervise student projects for our Master of Writing degree. It's my regular exercise in humility, mentoring young writers with talent and potential to become great. Back in the days, the olden times when social sciences were considered Marsden-worthy, I was funded for a project called Korero Mai, Tell Us Your Earthquake Story. It was a longitudinal study of post-disaster narratives. In our proposal, I argued that when narratives of catastrophe are shared beyond immediate participants, they engage society through empathy and identification. And I mentioned myths of great floods, and I mentioned Samuel Pepys burying his whole Parmesan cheese to preserve it from the fire of London. Stories of peril and survival that sit close to the root of social life. And I am interested in language. Language fascinates me. In his novel Believers to the Bright Coast, my PhD supervisor Vincent O'Sullivan has a character describe language as the harshest and finest knife we can use. I'm a liar, says another of Vince's characters, a lawyer, and I understand much more about myself than if I told the truth. There's ample evidence that storytelling can lead to self-knowledge, and that it can be a primary vehicle for persuading others. How we persuade others of the truth is a question at the heart of much art, and perhaps a conundrum we ask ourselves, as I did this morning in the mirror. What version of myself should I offer as truth? What might explain my interest in storytelling? So here's a story. For starters, I think my former teachers would be surprised to see me receiving this honour. I doubt I was on anyone's list of potential future academics. My father was a teacher. My parents became Salvation Army officers when I was 2 years old, and childhood involved moving every few years. 5 of those years were spent in Zimbabwe when it was Rhodesia, where we mainly did correspondence schooling because Ian Smith's government forbade black and white children learning together. For one uninspiring year, I attended an all-white day school where I lived in quiet terror of a teacher named Mr. Boris who resembled a deflated Hermann Goering. Thanks to this peripatetic education, I wasn't a motivated student, but I did have one strong motivation. I loved a good book. Stories captivated me. I would spend hours reading until my frustrated mother would drive me outside to force me to play. I abandoned school 2 weeks into the 7th form and took the first job available, which happened to be at the Ministry of Works and Development, often colloquially known then as the Ministry for Wanton Destruction. I became a stores clerk, cruelly assigned the numerical definition 007. There I was, banded 007 101, earning, I still remember, $5,482 per annum. For nearly 7 years, the life suited me. I once audited fuel and explosives for regional depots around the South Island. I recall shaking in terror while the Kaikoura storekeeper counted the gelignite by tossing sweaty little wax paper sausages from one cardboard box to another. I survived and moved to head office, which was on the 11th floor of the Vogel building just down the road, where every morning I gathered up 100-foot-long overnight faxes from Japan containing quotes for pipes and valves for Robert Muldoon's Motunui synthetic fuels plant. In my last role in the Dunedin Civil Engineering Office, I helped administer the roading projects associated with the Clyde Dam. Still, when I drive around Lake Dunstan, the names of creeks and culverts remind me of the stages of construction. And quietly, I am a head of the English department, but I've quite possibly worked longer in the Civil Engineering Office than many of my engineering colleagues. Perhaps I'd have stayed, but in 1984, wanton destruction appeared in the form of Roger Douglas's public sector reforms. The literature academic in me feels that this really deserves a quote from George Orwell's 1984, something like, "We shall make you hollow, we shall squeeze you empty, and then we shall fill you with ourselves." But as I recall, the mood was captured by a rise sign near the door that simply said, "Could the last one fired please turn out the lights?" The lights for the Ministry of Works went out finally in 1988, which was the year I returned quite reluctantly to study. I admit I had part of a very undistinguished commerce degree from Otago University, which I'd pursued as a way to get a few hours out of the office. But in a rare moment of good sense, I followed my father's advice, abandoned my commerce degree and enrolled in arts. My average grade jumped from a C- to an A. Something had clicked. Well, actually, two things clicked, because in my classical Greek literature class, as well as discovering Homer, I discovered a woman with remarkable red hair, who's now my wife, Kay, and has been for quite a while. For the first time, learning engaged me. Without any plan, just curiosity, I went on to complete my PhD at Victoria University and in 1997 become a junior lecturer. And that is a story of how I arrived in academia. All of it's true, but it's also true that had I marshalled other facts, that story could have been different. It's something I'm always reminded of when I'm writing biography, that what I select and what I include tells a story of a life that could be told in other ways. Because English was always my best subject, and in my life, curiosity was something that was strong, and I think I was inclined to range widely on things rather than become focused, and that explains, I think, the many threads that I've followed. All of this perhaps speaking to my interest in the power of language and the risks and rewards when we tell stories. My PhD was on the poet James K. Baxter. Baxter lived with the power and frustration of language. He once likened writing a poem to a man wearing 3 pairs of gloves and trying to pick up a key from the ground. But he also called words set in order mental possessions, and said it is absurd to say I am a poor man while I keep on putting words together. My primary research has been about telling and retelling the stories of writers. I've worked with archives and manuscripts and personal interviews and hunted out overlooked materials in order to construct these narratives. My biography, No Fretful Sleeper, A Life of Bill Pearson, took me nearly a decade to research and write. Bill Pearson's life proved far more complex than we had understood. For most of his adult life, his homosexuality was a carefully guarded secret. Even his major works, his essay Fretful Sleepers and his novel Coal Flat, had been shaped to preserve that secret. So it was a challenging book to write. It took me into areas I felt supremely unqualified to deal with, and yet it was a story that needed to be told. I got lots of feedback on it. One that mattered the most to me was a letter from an elderly New Zealand man, a senior public figure whose name I recognise, who wrote to thank me. "You have described my life," he said. Like Pearson, he had lived in silence, yet faithfully served a country that might once have imprisoned him. I think my best work has involved bringing hidden or marginalised stories into view. My greatest honour, I think, in life has been a long engagement with J.C. Sturm, one of my greatest honours. That's perhaps the clearest example of the way that stories are important and bring people to life. Sturm was born Te Kari Papuni. She was raised in the Pakeha world. She was for a long time known mainly as James K. Baxter's wife. She was for many years barely acknowledged as a writer. Now, through our decades of collaboration, I have seen her work come to be seen as central to the history of Māori literature in English. And you may know her work without realising it. If you're down near the new rebuilt Central Library, her early poem, Brown Optimism, sits 9 metres high on the exterior of the building. Through that work, storytelling became not just about interpretation, but about connections and relationships, about building trust, enabling voices, and helping ensure a writer's place in the cultural record. My interest in storytelling extends beyond individuals to how stories are preserved and shared. It underpins my digital humanities activities. It led to the formation of the New Zealand Electronic Tech Centre, built on a quite simple idea that our stories should be accessible and open and enduring. After the Canterbury earthquakes, that idea took on urgency with the seismic Canterbury Earthquake Digital Archive and our QuakeBox longitudinal study. Here, storytelling became immediate and collective, the recording of lived experience in real time. Seismic is at heart a repository of stories created by a community responding to disaster with a particular focus on marginalised and silenced voices. Across all my work, including the development of the UC Arts Digital Lab, my current research with Natalia Shaban on the communication of Ukrainian cultural heritage, I think one principle remains constant. Storytelling is not just an object of study, but a legitimate and valuable research practice. It involves interpretation, but also preservation, collaboration and creation. It involves building the conditions in which stories can be told and ensuring they endure. If there's a single idea that unifies my work, it is that storytelling matters, not only because it shapes how we understand literature, but because it shapes how we understand ourselves. We are storytelling animals, and telling stories is what makes us human. Thank you.